I am so thankful for, I heard something I haven't heard in a while. This is not how I was going to begin, but I will tell you that I heard Bruce, that it was a thing when I was president of Harding, that students, if you're up front and you got a U in your name, you know, people love to go, ooh, whatever. Well, every year at Spring Sing, I would get up to present the trophy the final evening, and when I would step out from the curtain and I would go out there, there would be this, ooh. People who didn't know thought the student body was booing me. And I have written more letters telling people that's not what was going on. My feelings are not hurt and all of that. And it was just a part of life. But whoever did that, that was a great memory. I wanted to begin by saying, I love this church. I do. I love this event. I love this workshop. It's not just another workshop. It's not just a good workshop, an excellent workshop. It is a workshop that is calling the church to once again turn out and to look upon the harvest. And it's something we need. And I'm so thankful for the Prestoncrest elders and for Jacob and his role in this, for taking the leadership in this. This has been a refreshing weekend as people have opened the Bible and they've called us back to who we are and what we are to be. So I'm so thankful to be here and to be a part of this weekend. And I got to speak in this slot last year at the end of the conference. And it's so good to be back here now knowing something of the bigger picture of it all. And I just feel more a part of this church. And I do. I love being here. And when you travel around and you're in a lot of different congregations, you can tell it when you walk into a place and people like each other. And when they care about each other, and when there's a tenderness and a kindness there, and the kind of a place that you would love for anybody that you are talking to or inviting, you would love for them to come and plant themselves right in the middle of this. So this is a great experience, and I'm so thankful to get to be here. The world has gone crazy. You didn't have to come to church to hear that today. You've been hearing it all week long. Anytime you turn on media, right, left, center, wherever it is, you turn it on and people are going to be wringing their hands and they're going to be saying the wheels are coming off. There are so many things about the world right now. The world has gone crazy. And there are a lot of people running around and saying the world is going crazy. A lot of people despairing. A lot of people sort of giving up. And if we're not careful as Christians, we can run around with the same folks, with our hair on fire and with our despair. And we can just simply add to what's going on in the world. But we got good news today. And the good news is the Lord reigns. Would you say it with me? The Lord reigns. And it's something that the people of God have always been told. And something that we've always struggled with because people of God have always lived in difficult times. But I want us to start this morning with Daniel chapter 2, a text that deals with our theme about that we have received a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Daniel lived in crazy times. He was yanked away from his homeland, from his family, from his faith. Maybe not his faith, but the trappings of his faith. And he was taken to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, who was a man that no one could speak truth to at that time. Nebuchadnezzar, one night, he has a dream. And when he wakes up the next morning, he knows that this dream did a number on him. And he's all stirred up inside, and he doesn't know what to do with it. And what do I make of it all? But the problem is, he doesn't even remember the dream. So he calls his wise men, and they come in before him, and he says, I had this dream. It distressed my spirit. I want you to tell me what the dream was, and I want you to tell me what the dream means. And the wise men just sort of turn and look to each other, and they're thinking, he's crazy. And they would have been right. But he also was a person that had life and death control over everybody that saw his face. So he says, tell me what the dream was and what it meant. And they said, King, you know, we're wise men and we can interpret dreams, but we can't tell you what was in your head if you don't tell us. And he immediately became furious, and he threatened to kill them all if they kept procrastinating. He said, you tell me what it was right now, and you tell me what it meant. He's furious, and he determines that he's going to kill the wise men of Babylon. So the word goes out, and the word gets to Daniel, who was one of the young men from Judea who was in training to be an advisor to the king. And Daniel goes and tells his friends to pray to the Lord, or else they're all going to die. Well, Daniel has the vision. And so he goes in before the king, and he says, "O king, here is what you dreamed. And what you dreamed was that there was this great statue, and that there were, what you saw, verse 31, this imagery, mighty and exceeding brightness, stood before you, and it appeared, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver. In the middle and thighs they were of bronze, and its legs were of iron. Its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And king, as you looked, a stone was cut out with no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold all together were broken into pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." King, that's the dream that you had. Now, king, here's what it means. He says in verse 44, "In those days, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all the kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut out from the mountain with no human hand, and that it broke in the pieces, the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, the interpretation is sure, and the kingdom shall never be destroyed." In a lot of different ways, a lot of different times, a lot of different places, a lot of different chaos, that message has been remembered by the people of God. Say it with me. The Lord reigns. And it's something that is very much a part of our story. And one of the things we've done this weekend in gathering together, I've heard a lot of Bible preached. And it's really been a powerful weekend because of that. And so much of this workshop has simply been calling us back to remember things like this and to remember our story. I want to pull a thread. I want to tug it one more time that I had used when I spoke on this platform last year at this time. And I told you about my wife and I going to see a movie in Little Rock several years ago. It was called Medea's Family Reunion. You always hear chuckling when you even announce that. You have people that look at you sideways forevermore after that, but they wonder, what in the world are you talking about? Well, my wife and I were there in the theater, and we watched the movie, and it was about a large black family in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And they were dealing with all the stuff that families deal with. And toward the end of the movie, they are at the reunion. They finally get there to the reunion. And so you know that for every single one of us, you go to a family reunion, there's some stuff going on. You know, there are relationships that haven't been easy, and it's all happening right there. And in this movie, there was a point where there was a scene, and I leaned over to my wife and I said, while we were watching the movie, I said, I'm going to use this in my Acts class. I was teaching college sophomores the book of Acts. I said, I'm going to use this first day of my Acts class. Because what happened in that scene was that the women were all gathered in the kitchen. And you know how that after a while, a lot of times men will go one direction and the women will go somewhere else. And the women were in the kitchen and they were snapping beans. And old Aunt Ruby, the oldest member of the family, way up in her 90s, she walks out of the bedroom and she says, I want to be with the family. And so all the women get up and they began to walk out the door and down the path. You don't know where they're going. They're headed to a cabin that you see in the picture here. And they as they go along, they see all kinds of family problems. They see the young men down on their knees shooting dice. And as they're gambling, they're pushing and fighting with each other. They see some of the young women, and the way they're dancing is just so incredibly suggestive that these older women just wince their eyes and they shake their heads and they walk on. And there were old men who were drinking and just a lot of things going on. But they walk on toward the cabin. They get to the cabin, and Aunt Ruby, up in her 90s, reaches over and pulls the pull cord on the dinner bell. And so everybody, they don't know what's going on, but they come to where they are. They get there, and Aunt Ruby says, is this what we paid for? And I didn't know what she meant. And a little boy says, what's she talking about? And at that point, there are these two old aunts, Maya Angelou plays one role, and Cicely Tyson plays the other one. And Cicely Tyson steps up on the porch, and wow, what a message. She steps up on the porch, and she said this: the man and the woman who were born here gave birth to this generation. They were slaves. They had no choice. They worked this ground and they bought it from the widow of the slave owner. And then she said, that's the blood that's running through our veins. That's the stock we are made of. And she had a refrain where she kept asking him, do you remember your story? Do you remember your story? Do you know your family story? Do you know the people you came from? Do you know what they went through? Do you know about the blood that runs through your veins? Do you understand the stock that you came from? And I thought when I heard that night in the theater, I thought that's how we're going to launch into the book of Acts. And we're going to say, this is going back. It's going to be a semester devoted to remembering our story, where we came from, the stock we are from, that we're made of, and the blood that runs through our veins. And as we talk today, as we focus today on how the Lord reigns, let's remember our story. Let's drop down in it in a few places. In the book of Acts, chapter 4, that very quickly the church begins to deal with opposition. And so Peter and John have healed this lame beggar at the temple. And the powers that be came and said this, we don't like this. We want you to stop this. And so in chapter 4, beginning with verse 1, as they were speaking to the people, the priests and the captains of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them, greatly annoyed, because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. Can you imagine what church would be like this morning if the doors in the back flew open and people in uniforms came in here and seeing me standing up here with my Bible and speaking of God? They saw me as being in violation of something, and they came up and they put me in handcuffs. Can you imagine the tension in this room? Can you imagine how sick to our stomach we would feel? Has something forever changed in this world? Is there no going back? I would tell the students in my Acts class, we'd come to a story like this, and I would say, someday. And they always knew when I sort of took a breath and I turned sideways, they knew that the refrain is coming. And I would say, someday, you're going to be somewhere in a church and bad things are going to happen. And I said, there's going to be no shortage of people that day who are running around with their hair on fire and who are wringing their hands and who are saying, oh, woe is us. And I would say, when that day happens, my prayer for you is that you're going to stand up and you're going to say, wait a minute, I've read the story. I know what happens when this kind of stuff goes on. And instead of adding your sense of chaos to the chaos around you, you're going to stand up and you're say, no, wait a minute. I know our story. I know the blood that runs through our veins. And it ends well. And we're going to survive this. And we're going to be better than okay. Because, say it with me, the Lord reigns. And so they were arrested, but then we find immediately after the arrest, and you can imagine it would be in the papers and upsetting in so many ways, but many of those who had heard the word believed, and the number of men came to about 5,000. You've just gotten the worst news. The world has gone crazier than it's ever been, and yet because the Lord reigns, God takes care of this, and the outcome is great. And so that the number of men came to about 5,000. Acts chapter 4. And more than ever, believers were added. Acts chapter 4 with the hypocrisy. Something goes on. Problems out there are tough. But when we see failings in here, it's 10 times tougher. And we get to Acts chapter 5, and the early church, there's been the imprisonment of apostles, but in Acts chapter 5, we find that there is hypocrisy among us. Ananias and Sapphira have sold some land, and people are giving the proceeds of the land, and the apostles are distributing it to those who were in need, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. There was not a needy person among them. And yet we get to chapter 5, and somebody goes and sells some land, and they make pretense of what they're doing. They generously bring some money, but they act like they're giving all the money. And as a result, they're asked, why is it that you have contrived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to man, but to God. And Ananias falls dead. A little later, his wife comes in, does the same thing. And Peter said to her in verse 9, he said, how is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Can you imagine the panic in the church when two people have fallen dead because they have told a lie to the Lord? And so there is great fear. Now, there were probably people there, I'm certain there were people there, who were running around with their hair on fire, wringing their hands, and saying, this is awful, this is terrible, it's an awful, no good, very bad day. And yet, it's not where the story ends. And what we read after that in verse 12 is that now many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles. And they were all together in Solomon's portico. None of the rest dared join them because the people held them in high esteem. They're respected and they are feared. And then in verse 14, and more than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women. Chapter 6, we find complaining. Complaining just sort of drains our spirit, especially when it's our brothers and sisters in the Lord. And people are just sort of yang. And they're talking about the injustice of the way we're distributing food. And so once again, this could be a thing where this has been a nice run. It's been sweet while there were no needy people among us. But, the complaining starts here, and we're falling apart. Could be our worst day, but it wasn't. Because, say it with me, the Lord reigns. And as a result of this, in chapter 6, verse 7, we're told that the word of God continued to increase, and the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. They have fussing going on, and we expect there's going to be a subtraction. But instead, there is a multiplication. and the number of believers, disciples, multiplies greatly in Jerusalem. There's martyrdom in chapter 7. Stephen, a loved, respected, powerful preacher, stands up and he preaches in Christ the resurrection of the dead. And as he preaches, the people just get crazy furious. And they drag him out and they stone him to death. And when they do, it unleashes a fierce persecution led by Saul of Tarsus. And we read that there arose a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. Once again, people are chaotic and they're crazy. And there was an abundance of people who would say this is the end, but you and I know that that's not our story. Because, say it with me, the Lord reigns. And because of this, what we find, one of my favorite verses in Acts, chapter 8 and verse 4. Now those who were scattered, sounds like a negative word, those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Hey, this looked like this was going to be a tragedy, an absolute disaster. And yet we're going to multiply again. Because you take Christians and you persecute them and you send them out into the world. And they're not able to be together with each other like they want to be. But you know what? Wherever you send them, they're taking that message with them. And so this is good news. There's disagreement. Terrible disagreement in chapter 15. After the first missionary journey, enough people have sort of flowed into the church. And the center of gravity, Jew-Gentile, begins to shift. And when a few Gentiles was an okay thing, you start getting a mass of them, maybe a majority of them, and it gets scary. These folks want to bring pork chops to the church potluck. And it just, this could be awful. And so there are people who decide enough's enough. We're going to draw the line, and we're going to say, you have to become, that Gentiles have to become Jews in order to become Christians. And the Lord realized that this was something that was going to stop things in its track, because it was no little mistake. This was a mistake at the heart of the gospel message. They had a gathering in Jerusalem. The leaders of the church convened. This is the problem that's going on. What are we going to do about it? I'm sure that while this was happening, there were people running around in circles with their hair on fire, wringing their hands. Woe is us. This may be the end. But it wasn't. Matter of fact, it turned out to be an incredibly great day for the church, because the Lord is faithful. And as a result, there was a letter written, sent out to the churches. It was delivered. When the people read it out in the churches in the countryside, they rejoiced because of its encouragement. Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul, on his second missionary journey, finds himself in Athens. And there he's going around and sharing the good news, but he's ridiculed out in the marketplace, and they call him a seed picker. They said, you're kind of an intellectual seed picker, like a bird going around and just picking up this and that, and that's what you're out talking about. So he's invited to speak to the Areopagus, the council of the philosophers of the city. And the Apostle Paul goes and he speaks to them. And he knows who he's standing in front of. And he knows that these people laugh at people who speak of the bodily resurrection. They would call you a fool if you spoke of the bodily resurrection. And the Apostle Paul stands toe-to-toe with them, doesn't blink, and he says that, and of this, verse 31, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. He was in a room where he knew you would hear breaking glass if he said resurrection. And he said resurrection. And to this day, this is one of the great sermons in the history of the world, not because it was tremendously successful, not because he converted the city of Athens, not because the Areopagus were all convinced by his arguments. A few were, but they mocked. Is anything more difficult than that? Being looked upon as being a fool? But you and I are talking about that sermon 2,000 years later because a champion of ours stood toe-to-toe with the Areopagus and did not flinch. And he did not compromise. And he spoke the truth of the gospel like it had to be spoken. Resurrection. The Lord is faithful. And then at the end of the book of Acts, prison itself, the Apostle Paul spent about a third of his recorded ministry in jail or in captivity in some way or other. We could run around and wring our hands and talk about how this is so awful. At the end of the book of Acts, we read that he lived there for 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. If this were a movie, what would the music be right there? You know, music plays on our emotions and all, and we watch movies, and the music tells us, is this good news or bad news? Is this sad or is this happy? What's the music going to be right here? He's in prison for 2 more years. But I believe the music behind this text is music of joy and of power and of excitement, because he may be in prison, his rights may have been taken away, but because, say it with me, the Lord is faithful. The Lord's faithfulness there, and the Lord reigns. He is in control, that he was able to preach with boldness and without hindrance. If you see me in church some Sunday and we're sharing the Lord's Supper, there's a good chance that I'm going to be thinking about Alexander Solzhenitsyn as I reflect on the cross. Solzhenitsyn was a Soviet dissident, and he spent 8 years in a Russian gulag, a concentration camp. It's the sort of thing that just works your body and your spirit into the ground. Solzhenitsyn, somewhere during that time, lost hope. He gave up. And he was working out in a field with a shovel, and he just gave up. And he went over and sat down on a crude workbench by the side of the field, leaned his shovel up against the bench, and he sat down, and he waited to die. He waited to die because he'd seen it happen before. He knew eventually a guard would come over, and a guard would say he would curse him, probably tell him get back to work, and when he didn't get up, the guard would probably beat him to death with his own shovel. He just knew that's what was coming next. He sits there, he has no hope, and he doesn't want to live. Eventually, he senses someone next to him. Thought it might have been in the guard, but it wasn't. It was an old man, another prisoner, someone who he had always thought of had kind of a face with no light in it. And the old man didn't say a thing, didn't look at him, but he grabbed a stick and he dragged it through the dirt. And he picked it up and he crossed the line. He made the sign of the cross in the dirt. And Solzhenitsyn, in looking back on that, would say, the whole world changed in that moment. And he remembered that the Lord reigns. The Lord reigns. It seemed like the politics of the day was what controlled everything. But he remembered that Jesus rose from the dead and that the Lord reigns. And life came back into his soul in that moment. And he got up and he went back to work. He didn't die that day. And he went on to write books that would sell tens of millions of copies and would shine a light on things that needed to be seen. I think about that during the Lord's Supper quite often. And I think that, what we're doing as we eat the bread and we drink the cup, as a group of people together, we're dragging a stick through the dirt. And we're making a sign of a cross. And we're reminding each other that the Lord reigns. And it changes everything. And it gives us hope and it gives us life. And it says that even if we die, we're not defeated. The Lord reigns. When I was president of a university for 7 years, I began to notice something that I was saying that I didn't like. It was in my first year, and I began to hear myself. You know how you can say things and you don't even notice what you're saying, and then after a while you say, did I really say that? And I began to notice that I was saying far too often, I assumed that. I was beginning a lot of sentences, as a president of a university, I was beginning a lot of sentences with the words, I assumed that. Now, some of you you're ahead of me, and you know that any sentence that begins with, I assumed that, ends up in the ditch. Something went wrong. You failed in some way. That I assumed that everybody knew this. I assumed that someone would take care of that. I assumed that was understood. And I realized that I've got to clean up my language, and I've got to take that out of there. Well, was fairly successful in doing that. And then the second year, I began to hear myself saying something that I did not like. And the thing I was saying in the second year, because I'd been to an awful lot of conferences, and we were always talking about the next problems coming down the road. And when you're dealing with the things in a university, it might be your accrediting organization. Or it might be the NCAA and what their next rules are going to be. Or it might be about the Department of Education and what we're going to have to deal with in terms of Pell Grants, and we might lose this or whatever. And because of that, in a lot of my conversations talking about those things, I would begin with the words, I'm afraid that. And before I ever really thought about it, I sensed it. I sensed that the people of God should not be starting sentences with the words, I'm afraid that. That's not our chorus. That's not what we should be about. That's not what the people that I engage out there should hear, or the people in here. That I begin with, I'm afraid that. What I should have been saying was, the Lord reigns. And everything's different. Everything's different when that goes on. You and I are going to be tempted all this week to join in the poor-mouthing that goes on out there in the world. Whether it's about athletics or it's about our city or politics or whatever it is, there's just a world of angry poor-mouthing going on out there. And we are tempted just to sort of fit in, to kind of go along with it. And sometimes it even happens here in the assembly. And outsiders who are visiting here may hear us talking in the same way, saying, I'm afraid that, whatever. How different this world will be. How different our lives will be. How much more powerful our evangelistic witness will be when we don't begin with, I'm afraid that, but we say, the Lord reigns. It's a different world. It's a different world. The kingdom of the Lord will not be destroyed. We are on the right side. It will be victorious. We will be victorious because the Lord reigns. And so something that I've made a commitment to start doing more is that when distress is discussed, not in a sanctimonious way, not in your face way, but in a humble way, when I am tempted to be drawn into negative conversations out there or in here, to respond with a smile that's kind and the words, the Lord reigns. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and that changes everything. This morning, if you are ready to come to the Lord. Know that it's an eternal kingdom that will not be destroyed that we are proclaiming. Jesus rose from the dead, never to die again. And whatever the distress is that we face right now, that we feel in our guts right now, or that we may face in the coming week, we can say with love in our hearts and a smile on our face, say it with me one last time, the Lord reigns. This morning, if you need to make that confession of your faith in Jesus, to come and to be baptized into Christ, if you need to bring before the church something that's just grinding you into the ground, I guarantee you that these people can be trusted with your struggles and will pray with you and for you and walk with you through life as you deal with those. This morning, may we have joy in our hearts as we remember that the Lord reigns. Respond in whatever way you need to as we stand and sing.